I've had the privilege to teach at our Unitarian Universalist Seminary here in Chicago, Meadville, Lombard. And one of the things that I ask my students to do every semester is to write a 5-page paper on their sources of hope. I tell them, what is the fundamental theological or philosophical or psychological source of hope from which you draw in your preaching to speak to people in despair, one sort or another? I tell them in this 5-page paper, don't give me a sermon you would preach. Tell me the source of hope that you call on. Tell me what you would go to, what you would point to, what would you invoke to find that hope. It's, of course, it's sort of an impossible assignment. 5 pages is either way too little space or way more space than you need to articulate sources of hope. In truth, sometimes I feel like this assignment is a little bit like that old joke of adults asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up, in order to get ideas from the kids for new possibilities for the adults to go and be. This is me asking them. I get to read a dozen people telling me what their sources of hope are when my own reserves are growing thin. It's a pretty sweet deal for me, really. They tell me beautiful things. They say beautiful things. They say, I am in the midst of despair and trauma, and yet I still get up every day. They say, my mother taught me things to do to find hope, not just to sit there and wait for hope to arrive at me, but practice. They say there is a love that flows through self and community and the infinite. And it's there whether we know it or not, whether we feel it or not, it's there. Trust. They say hope is a quiet thing. Hope is an ember inside our bodies, inside our souls, inside our spirits, inside our hearts. Hope is a quiet thing, and you find it in the little things. One student said, my hope begins with compassion towards myself. How can I have hope for the world if I'm walking around being mean to myself all day? Hope begins with compassion that faces in and then faces out. Hope does not just spring eternal. Hope does not just spontaneously, continuously show up. Hope is in the small. Hope is in the small. It makes me think of Timuel Black here, who often says history teaches hope in little ways and big ones. And I love the student who wrote, I'm not a philosopher. As if a less polite academic way of saying it would be like, listen, buddy, I'm not giving you hope flowcharts and hope schematics. What I care about, which is true, which is what we all care about, is what are the tools that we have with us to find hope when despair is sitting on the doorstep right there. Emily Dickinson writes, famously, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. This is it. This is the language that we need for hope. Not philosophy and flowcharts, but poetry, because this thing is mysterious. It arrives unexpected. It is weak and it is unconquerable. It perches, says the poet, not in our thinking mind, not even in our hearts, but somewhere deeper in our soul, inside that faculty of ourselves which touches, which encounters, which perceives mystery. Hope dwells in that part of ourselves which walks on the wet sand between high tide and low tide, between known ground and unknown life itself. Hope lives in that part of us that exists in the universe before even our meaning making. That's the home for hope. That's what it means to perch in our souls. That's the home for hope that lives inside us, fragile and indestructible. Two years ago, maybe 3, in what feels like another life entirely, like another country, like another world, long ago, right? Working in my office on a Thursday afternoon, Madeira came in. One of our long time pillars. She was our office volunteer that day. And she came in holding in her hands, tenderly, gently, a little sparrow. Madeira, I hope you're watching right now. I hope you remember this moment. This thing with feathers had flown full force into the window, right outside where she was sitting at the front, into the window on the front doors. And it had dropped to the ground motionless, and so moved by compassion, not knowing if she was acting as nurse or as undertaker, Madeira picked it up, and finding its heart still beating fast in her hand, body stunned, still motionless, she brought it in to show me, to hope and to wonder together at this wild little life resting in her palm. Until a few minutes later, she took it back outside again and set it down under a bush where we hoped it might be safe from the hawks, from the falcon in the neighborhood. And then later when she went out again, it was gone. Hope is that feeling of holding that little life in your hand. It's the feeling of standing on the shoreline of mystery. It's the feeling woven into the fabric of all life, the experience, hearing that sweet song unstopped even in a storm, heart beating, even as the body is still. It would be easier just to give you a definition. It would be easier just to tell you that everything's going to be fine or that everything's going to be terrible. It would be easier to tell you, I know how it's going to turn out in the end. It's all good. It's a less satisfying and a more honest answer to tell you that hope is just a complicated business, that the seeds of possibility are here, that another world exists here inside this one, that the possibilities of change are real and aren't guaranteed. And they're real anyways. It's harder to tell you that hope lives in a place inside you which is felt, which is experienced, which happens before our thinking about it. That hope lives in a place inside us that we're tuning ourselves to hear, trying to listen for that song through the storm, through the night. It's harder, but it's more honest too to tell you that hope takes time. And it doesn't come on a timetable. Hope doesn't just automatically show up at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Not for you, not for me. We find it and we lose it and we find it again. On and on and on. It reminds me that in the Christian tradition, Easter, a celebration of hope, in the Christian tradition, Easter isn't a Sunday, it's a season. Eastertide, a whole season of the church calendar, which is meant to be a season of the Spirit. 50 days long. So much of what we think of as Christianity today as a fixed and immovable part of this tradition are innovations that happen long after the death of Jesus. But the practice of an Easter season in Christianity, unlike Lent, unlike Advent, which come later, this Eastertide season was celebrated in the very earliest church. And I wonder what hope felt like, what the experience of hoping felt like for those very earliest followers of Jesus, before there was such a thing as Christians, in the months that followed the death of their teacher. The rabbi who had preached to them radical love and acceptance, the one who taught and healed, the one who actually, in fact, created a community where everyone counted and everyone mattered, where people were judged on the content of their character and judged with abiding and abounding grace. The one who had invited them into that way of living had died. And when would come the world that they dreamed of? The season that followed was a season of uncertainty as much as it was a season of hope. A people who knew another way of living was possible, who knew that another world lived inside this one, like a nesting doll, a community and a life founded on compassion. It was possible. And they lived in that place of hope and uncertainty all together. And I think of them finding and losing hope again, and I think of the wisdom of a season of hoping 50 days long, because it can take that long to find the thing. It can take that long at last to hear the notes singing from that little thing with feathers perched in the storm. There's wisdom in that season. For them, as for us, resolve must come and go just like the weather changes. The seeds of goodness in them, just like in us, needed time to sprout on their own. Hope doesn't come just because it's 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning. It comes in time. It comes in community. It comes in looking in the small. It comes in listening carefully. From deep despair and perished things, a green shoot always springs. Something always sings. Sooner or later. That's the message an Easter season brings. That's the message a season of hoping brings. The writer E.B. White, in his later years, received a letter from someone despairing of the state of the world, despairing of human nature and humanity, and believing the writer's task to be hope and the uplift of humanity. He wrote back this. He said, in the language of the day, "As long as there is one upright man, as long as there is one compassionate woman, the contagion may spread, and the scene is not desolate. Hope is the thing that is left to us in a bad time. I shall get up Sunday morning and wind the clock as a contribution to order, to steadfastness." Sailors have an expression about the weather. They say the weather is a great bluffer. I guess the same is true of our human society. Things can look dark, then a break shows in the clouds and all is changed, sometimes rather suddenly. It's quite obvious the human race has made a queer mess of life on this planet. This was in the 1970s he was writing. But as a people, we probably harbor seeds of goodness. We probably harbor seeds of goodness that have lain for a long time waiting to sprout when conditions are right. Man's curiosity, his relentlessness, his inventiveness, his ingenuity have led him into deep trouble. We can only hope these same traits enable him to claw his way out. Hang on to your hat, hang on to your hope, and wind the clock, for tomorrow is another day. Hang on to your hope, hang on to your hat, and wind the clock, for tomorrow is another day. Our service ends, and our work begins again to be a people of hope, to be a people listening for that song. Go in peace, and amen.